Yeah, they all are. We're talking about Pennsylvania here. We'll get to that in just a second. But 2 weeks until the midterm elections, new polling shows extremely tight races in all those battleground states, many of them won by President Biden in 2020. We'll start in Pennsylvania. Democrat John Fetterman, Republican Mehmet Oz vying to replace retiring Republican Senator Pat Toomey. The latest CNN poll has Fetterman leading by 6 points among likely voters, and they will debate tonight. In the race for Pennsylvania's governor, Democrat Josh Shapiro holding a 15-point lead over Republican Doug Mastriano, who was at the United States Capitol during the attack there on January 6th. In Wisconsin, that same CNN poll shows incumbent Republican Senator Ron Johnson and his Democratic challenger Mandela Barnes statistically tied. 50-49 is Johnson's lead there. In that state's government race, incumbent Governor Tony Evers and Republican Tim Michels also deadlocked within the margin of error. To Michigan. The CNN poll gives Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer a 6-point lead in her reelection fight over Republican Tudor Dixon. Meanwhile, 2 new polls showing a dead heat in the race to fill Ohio's open Senate seat. According to the latest Spectrum News Siena College survey, Republican J.D. Vance and Democratic Congressman Tim Ryan even at 46%, with 6% of likely voters still undecided. That's a 3-point gain for Vance since last month. And in another new poll from Marist College, Vance leads Ryan by just 1 point. That's within the margin of error. In that poll, 8% of registered voters say they still are undecided. So things tightening quickly. New Hampshire getting interesting as well. Republicans have closed the gap there too, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, you look at all of these races. Gene Robinson, I think Pennsylvania is a little bit tighter than the CNN polls show. I mean, at least the majority of polls show the Senate race being 2-3 points going into the Senate race tonight. Wisconsin, though, tied in the Senate. We had seen a Marquette poll showing Ron Johnson up 6. That's probably well outside the margin of error there. But this Wisconsin poll, like all the others I've seen, show it in a deadlock. Ohio in a deadlock. The Michigan governor's race much closer than people around Gretchen Whitmer wanted it to be. We suspected it would always tighten up at the end. The Arizona races, that Senate race where Kelly, like his 2020 race, Kelly was way ahead. Now that race is tightened up. Everything is tightening up, and it's tightening up on both sides.
Yeah, it is. There are things in these polls and this slew of polls, not just the CNN poll, but the others, that can give heart to both parties. I mean, Ron Johnson is an incumbent senator. It's very, very hard to knock off an incumbent senator, and it looks like Mandela Barnes is much closer than folks might have thought. Johnson usually wins by just a little, but it's unclear whether he's going to win this time. Similarly, Ohio should have been a complete slam dunk for Republicans. Had they nominated a normal Republican, we wouldn't be talking about that race, I think. They nominated J.D. Vance. And while, again, that poll we just showed shows a gain for Vance. The fact that this race is tied 2 weeks before the election is just amazing in Ohio. That's unusual, and I think it shows that, number one, Tim Ryan is a good candidate. Number two, J.D. Vance isn't a very good candidate. You've got actual data now coming out of Georgia with very heavy early voting. So people are trying to look and see who those voters are. Are Democrats getting a heavy vote from African Americans, or are they getting women and young voters out who might not be, every time voters in midterm elections? That race is extremely tight, obviously, but I think these heavy numbers are probably making Democrats a little bit happy and Republicans a little bit nervous. It's going to be a wild night in a couple of weeks. It really is. We're not going to know certainly the composition of the U.S. Senate, and might have some questions about the composition of the House going late into Tuesday night.
Yeah, and Jonathan Lemire, again, let's take a couple of more states. We just saw Georgia, a couple other states. We just saw Georgia there. deadlocked still in that poll. It's going to be tight. New Hampshire getting tighter in a recent poll than most expected. The Republicans had even pulled up stakes in New Hampshire, thought Maggie Hassan had it going away. Perhaps she does, but look at this poll. She goes from an 11-point lead in September to a 3-point lead in October. That's an Emerson poll. Again, just one poll, but she's an incumbent. You want to be over 50% in every poll that's taken. That's uncomfortably tight. But again, you look at Georgia, and you can look at Pennsylvania. You can look at other states. Early voting, just completely setting new records. Georgia, especially, we had heard about Jim Crow 2.0 in Georgia. It sure doesn't look that way. Major League Baseball moved the All-Star game because the obstacles to voting were supposedly so egregious, but they're setting records down there. Georgia voters are setting records. You look at the early voting in Pennsylvania, the interest in this race seems to be extraordinarily high for a midterm election.
Yeah, we saw that polling yesterday that shows the enthusiasm really high on both Republicans and Democrats, extraordinarily so for a midterm election. On Georgia, some voters talking to there say that those voting restrictions are actually a motivator to get out there and make sure they get their ballot counted. But this is, in this final fortnight, Joe, this is about as close and as scrambled as we can get in terms of the Senate. We should all brace ourselves. We may not have a winner Tuesday night. We might not know who controls that Senate for several days, depending on recounts and, of course, the possibility of that runoff in Georgia. But I was talking to senior Democratic officials yesterday, Joe, and quickly hitting on just a couple of states here. New Hampshire, they're aware of that poll. They're alarmed by the number, but they think she'll hold on, that Hassan will hold on. They feel like the infrastructure there is strong enough. It'll be a narrow win, but they're still feeling pretty good about that. Wisconsin's harder. They do worry, as Gene said, how difficult it is to knock off an incumbent senator. Tim Ryan has run about as good of a campaign as you can in Ohio. The institutions there, that's a state that has trended red. Democrats are hopeful, but they're not banking on that. They do worry that he may fall just short. But at minimum, Ryan there in Ohio, because he has been so competitive, Republicans have had to pour money into that state, which means that's money they can't spend elsewhere, which could help Democrats elsewhere on the map. And the last two, Arizona is one where that Senate race, Kelly still has a decent lead. Democrats in despair, though, about Kari Lake and that governor's race, really questioning the campaign strategy from their candidate, Katie Hobbs. And then, of course, there's Pennsylvania. Tonight, a debate that's going to matter. And I know we're going to talk about it more in a minute. But right now, Democrats do say this, that although Oz has closed the gap as national trends seem to favor Republicans, he's never caught Fetterman. Fetterman still has a lead. And Dems that I spoke to yesterday feel like Fetterman has stopped his slide. They think if he's good tonight, they like his chances. They still feel good about Pennsylvania.